Good morning, all. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. Before we get started, I want to introduce two friends of mine. As some of you have heard in the bulletin, or maybe you saw it on Facebook, that we have a special workshop today at 11 a.m. And two guys came over from Lansing to help us out with that. So I'm going to ask Scott Rolfe and Dennis Moore to stand. They're from Ministry Coaches MD. They're the doctors of ministry. And they're going to help us out a little bit thinking about the power of personal connections, the power of our personal relationships in ministry for Jesus Christ. And so that will take place at 11 a.m. in the gym. There's round tables. It's going to be discussion-oriented, and hopefully it'll put some feet to the sermon, to the passage that we look at, the principle that we're examining this morning. On my right shin, I have a 3-inch scar. And I blame Paul Orcutt for that. Now, Paul's not here to defend himself. Now he lives in Pennsylvania as a security specialist. But when I was a freshman in high school, Paul was one of the adult leaders that helped out with the youth group. And one of the things Paul taught me to do was to ride a Suzuki Quad Runner. How many people remember those or heard of those? A four-wheeler. A lot of fun. Get out there, especially through the corners. But he also taught me how to ride a motorcycle. And his particular case, we had a Yamaha YZ125, and that was a fast little booger. It scared me to death, but I also enjoyed it at the same time. Well, growing up in California, one of the fun things to do once you learn how to handle some off-road vehicles is to go exploring in the mountains. And so we were off checking out trails and exploring, and we got split up, and somehow my motorcycle, the one I was riding, died. And so I was trying to get it started again, and I went to kickstart it, and my foot slipped off the peg, and the peg dug into my shin and caused it to hurt. At the time, I didn't know I had cut it. But right through my jeans, it had left a nasty gash in my leg. Later on in the day, I noticed some discoloration on my pants, and it felt like my sock was kind of wet, and I figured out, I've been bleeding most of the day. That's great. And so now I have this 3-inch scar on my shin, and I will never forget Paul Orcutt and what he taught me to do as far as off-road riding. But Paul was influential not just in teaching me how to ride a motorcycle and a four-wheeler, he also taught me how to drive a stick shift in a Toyota SR5. Beautiful little vehicle with a wonderful engine. And he was a delivery driver, so he taught me some of the shortcuts for getting around town, some of the tricks of the trade, and it was fun to learn that. But that's not the only thing Paul taught me. He taught me also how to shave. Ooh. He didn't teach me how to shave up here, just down here. And he also taught me how to tie a tie. As you can see, Paul Orcutt had a big impact on my life. He taught me some of these really masculine things, but he also taught me some spiritual things. Just about every week we would go to a local ice cream joint called Foster's Freeze. And we would either work through Navigator's material or just work at the discipline of Bible reading. Paul wanted to help me learn how important that was and get in the habit of practicing that. And so Paul Orcutt had a significant impact on my life. The power of one life to affect another life cannot be underestimated. As we begin this new year, we need to think in terms of our personal connections, in terms of our relationships. And so this morning, from my own life and from a terrific example in Scripture, I want to help you think about the power of one. The power of one life to affect another life. If you would, turn with me and go to a place in the Bible we don't often visit, 2 Chronicles 24. 2 Chronicles 24. At the same time, if you have a scrap piece of paper in your Bible, or you just want to use your bulletin, because there's some space on the back, you can even use the cover for all I care. But later on in the service, I'm going to ask you to write down a few things. Not a lot. It's not going to be a ton. You're not writing a book. Don't be scared. But you might need to look around for a pencil in the pew or borrow one from somebody sitting next to you. But I want you to write something down later on. Now, after you've found 2 Chronicles 24, you can clear away the cobwebs, blow off the dust. We don't go there very often, but it's a wonderful book. It has some terrific illustrations about God keeping His promises. That's the theological context of the whole book of Chronicles, God keeping His promises. But in the aspect of relationships, we're looking at the life of King Joash. The life and the reign of King Joash is found in 2 Chronicles 24. But I want to give you some context before we get to his reign. And context in the Bible typically means looking at some of what's happening before. In this particular case, let's look at chapter 22 and chapter 23. I'm not going to ask you to turn there, but you can see the names on the screen. Joash is the third name down. He was preceded on the throne by his father, King Ahaziah. Unfortunately, in chapter 22, Ahaziah dies. And mom, Athaliah, moves in to take control. Now, she was not a nice lady. She was not the all-American mom. Her idea of taking control was to gather all the princes together, anyone who could have a claim to the throne, and execute them one by one. She wanted to take care of business. She wanted control of the region all to herself. And that's what she did, except she missed one, Joash. By the providence of God and through the actions of a guy named Jehoiada, a priest, Joash was stolen or taken away as a baby and tucked away. We're going to call the choir risers the temple. And I don't know if they stuffed the baby under the choir risers, but Jehoiada took the baby for his own good and protected him. Stuffed him away, hid him from Athaliah in order that he could raise him, train him, and at the appropriate time, put him in the appropriate seat of power so he could rule over the kingdom of Judah. So Jehoiada did something. He put his own life on the line in order to save Joash. And that's the context in which we find ourselves when we get to, you see some of that story in chapter 23. But when we get to chapter 24, we begin the reign of Joash. Let me read the first 3 verses. 2 Chronicles 24. Joash was 7 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 40 years. His mother's name was Zibiah. She was from Beersheba. Joash did what was right in the eyes of the Lord all the years of Jehoiada the priest. Jehoiada chose 2 wives for him, and he had sons and daughters. Right from the get-go, you can see the impact that Jehoiada had on Joash. First of all, he saves him from certain death by execution by his stepmother. And so he's taken away, and you can see the impact that this one life has on this very young life. Jehoiada the priest is there to save Joash. But it doesn't stop there. He continues to provide food and clothing and shelter. And for the first 6 or so years of his life, Jehoiada is overseeing this baby, toddler, this boy. And he determines that the right time, when this boy reaches 7 years of age, that's the right time to install him as king. So Jehoiada is thinking about what's good for Joash. Jehoiada is thinking about what's good for the kingdom. He's protected the boy, saved his physical life, but he's also invested in him. Jehoiada has put his own life on the line. But Jehoiada is not a dummy. Just as he showed his smarts and his wisdom by stealing away Joash at the right time to make sure he wasn't killed, he also made some political and some strategic moves. He interacted with other officials in the kingdom. As you can tell, Athaliah was not a nice lady. I'm sure during her reign she made some enemies. And Jehoiada knew who to talk to. Jehoiada made some connections with people in military power, people in political power. And so he was being smart. He was using some strategy. And when Joash reached the age of 7, he called upon these people that he had made connections with and said, it's time now to install the boy as king. And through an interesting turn of events, you really need to read it for yourself in chapter 23, they end up placing Joash on the throne and executing Athaliah. And that's how this young boy becomes king. From a place of turmoil and a place of hiding, he's placed on the throne to rule over a kingdom, the kingdom of Judah. Now, thankfully, Jehoiada is there. Jehoiada is there to guide him, to counsel him, to give him advice. When I was about a junior in high school, another college-age student came into my life. His name was Bill Whittington III. Doesn't that sound distinguished? Bill Whittington III. He drove them. I don't know why I remember the cars. Mazda RX-7. First one with rotary power and all that. It was pretty slick. But he asked me this weird question. He said, are you going to go out on a date sometime soon? Yeah, sure. I got to beat the ladies off with a stick. Of course I'm going to go out with somebody. And he said, well, you're going to want to impress her, and you're probably going to take her out to someplace nice to eat. Have you ever had a steak dinner? No. Steak's just like hamburger, right? You eat it. Well, it's not quite that simple, he says. And so we set up a time. I had to wear a tie and slacks. And we went to this restaurant that had more silverware than I was used to. He taught me how to use it. And at the end of our time together, he said, now you know how to at least act decently when you take a girl out on a date. Okay. He exercised some wisdom, some influence on me in teaching me how to behave. I don't know what it means, though, that the first date I ever took Norma out on was to Burger King. Maybe I didn't learn my lesson. But Jehoiada exercises considerable influence and has a tremendous impact on Joash. Not just in installing him on the throne, but during his reign. And his reign is going to start off beautifully. It's going to be terrific. If you look at verse 4, it says, sometime later, Joash decided to restore the temple of the Lord. This was a big deal. Maybe it doesn't jump out at you. Maybe if I said, we're not going to clean the church anymore. We're not going to spend any money on repairs. If the lights go out, they go out. If the projectors go down, we're not going to replace them. You understand that would be kind of dumb, right? It would be disrespectful to the building, to the people who gather here. There's something of the same idea happening with the temple. But in their culture, in the ancient Near East, the temple was important because that's where you paid homage to the deity that you worshiped. And it was no less true for the people of Israel, the people of Judah in this case. They had let the temple fall into a state of disrepair. It had crumbled, it had fallen, nobody was taking care of it. And so Joash decides to get his priorities straight. And I'm sure Jehoiada is speaking into his life, telling him what would be wise. And you see that at the end of chapter 3 when he talks about renewing the covenant with God. We're going to honor him. We're going to follow his commands. And part of that is respecting and honoring this place called the temple. And so he goes at the beginning of his reign, and it goes for a long time. It actually takes over half of his reign to restore the temple, to rebuild it, to repair it. There are some problems along the way in the financial department. It seems like either people weren't contributing enough, or the priests who were collecting it were taking it to buy their own game systems or something, upgrade their cars or their chariots. It seems like all the money wasn't going to the right place, and there was not significant progress on the temple restoration project. Jehoiada, again, brings wisdom to the reign of Joash and speaks into his life. And they come up with a different idea on how they can collect the funds, and they step in personally and say, we're going to administer the funds. We're going to pay the workmen who should be repairing the temple. We're going to interact and deal with the guys who are supposed to make this place sparkle and shine. And so when they step in, it finally changes things. It has a dramatic effect. You can see, skip down to about verse 8. At the king's command, a chest was made and placed outside at the gate of the temple of the Lord. A proclamation was then issued in Judah and Jerusalem that they should bring to the Lord the tax that Moses, the servant of God, had required of Israel in the desert. So all the officials and all the people brought their contributions gladly, dropping them into the chest until it was full. Whenever the chest was brought in by the Levites to the king's officials, and they saw that it was a large amount of money, the royal secretary and the officer of the chief priest would come and empty the chest and carry it back to its place. They did this regularly and collected a great amount of money. The king and Jehoiada gave it to the men who carried out the work required for the temple of the Lord. They hired masons and carpenters to restore the Lord's temple, and also workers in iron and bronze to repair the temple. The men in charge of the work were diligent, and the repairs progressed under them. They rebuilt the temple of God according to its original design and reinforced it. When they had finished, they brought the rest of the money, there were leftovers, to the king and Jehoiada, and with it were made articles for the Lord's temple, articles for the service and for the burnt offerings, and also dishes and other objects of gold and silver. As long as Jehoiada lived, burnt offerings were presented continually in the temple of the Lord. Jehoiada had a huge impact on Joash. But in case you missed it, he also impacted the nation. This work of glorifying, honoring, and respecting God by restoring the temple. In case you missed it, let me put these two verses together, and you'll see them on the screen, verse 2 and verse 14. Earlier, we find out Joash did what was right in the eyes of the Lord all the years of Jehoiada the priest. As long as Jehoiada was alive, Joash did the right thing. And as long as Jehoiada lived, burnt offerings were presented continually in the temple of the Lord. They weren't doing that before. They were not honoring Yahweh or the God of Abraham before then. They were doing their own thing, worshiping false gods. But in verse 15, something changes. Jehoiada was old and full of years, and he died at the age of 130. He was buried with the kings in the city of David because of the good he had done in Israel for God and his temple. It's hard to miss the impact Jehoiada had on Joash during the first part of his reign, during the majority of his reign. We saw it at the beginning of his life when he saved him from execution. We saw it as he trained him and raised him. We saw it as Jehoiada placed Joash in the seat of power and anointed him king and made sure he could rule over his kingdom. We saw it as Jehoiada guided and counseled him when he discovered some difficulties in this repair project. Jehoiada was there to advise him and counsel him, and he had significant influence on Joash. The impact of Jehoiada on Joash cannot be missed, but his presence will be missed as we continue his story. Earlier, I asked you to get out a piece of paper, and I'm going to ask you to write something down. And like I said, it can be the front of your bulletin, the back, the middle, the side, whatever. I told you earlier about my friend Paul Orcutt, the guy who had a significant impact on me. I imagine as I was sharing that, some of you thought of someone who had a significant impact on you. And what I'd like you to do is to write that person's name down. Write down a person who had a significant impact on your life. One of the things I'm going to ask you to do this morning as an assignment, either before the day ends or before we meet back here next Sunday, is to reach out to that person, to thank them for the positive influence, the impact that they've had in your life. Now, some of you might be in a position where, well, the person who impacted me is gone now. So I'm going to ask you to thank the Lord for that person, and then tell somebody else about how that person influenced your life. Share their story just as a simple act of gratitude. So if somebody influenced you and they're not here anymore, thank God for that person, but then tell somebody else about this person, so-and-so, what influence they had in your life. Later on, we're going to write down one more name on this paper. And then in the beginning of Joash's reign, we've seen the significance that Jehoiada played in his life. How he guided him, counseled him, protected him. But we need to see that in his absence, the reality, the power of one person to influence and impact another is really played out when Jehoiada is out of the picture. In a negative aspect, we see in verse 17, after the death of Jehoiada, the officials of Judah came and paid homage to the king, and he listened to them. Verse 18, they abandoned the temple of the Lord, the God of their fathers, and worshipped Asherah poles and idols. Because of their guilt, God's anger came upon Judah and Jerusalem. They abandoned the temple. The rebuilding, the restoration project that they had thrown themselves into, that Joash and Jehoiada had overseen personally, Joash seemed to walk away from it. Now he was under the influence of other people who weren't interested in Yahweh, the covenant-keeping God. They were interested in the Baals and Asherahs. Asherah is a god of fertility. And they were more interested in worshiping those idols and spending no time in the temple. it's a sad turn of events, but it's not the end of Joash's sad reign. He gets off to a tremendous start. And after Jehoiada is off the scene, he starts to go downhill, but it goes down fast and hard after that. If we were to read the next few verses, we'd find out that God was angry, but God was also merciful. God was angry, but He was also merciful. He was disappointed with how they were no longer honoring and respecting Him. And so He sent prophets, people to say to warn them, hey, you guys are getting off track. Hey, let's get back to the temple. Let's not disregard the worship of the one true God anymore. And those prophets were sent away, ignored. God is still angry. God is still merciful. And He calls upon a man named Zechariah to go speak to the king and his new set of counselors and advisors. The ironic thing is that Zechariah was the son of Jehoiada. The priest who had been a mentor to King Joash, his son is coming now to speak to Joash. And he shows up with the same message. Hey, why have you forsaken the Lord? You need to return to worshiping Him. Don't worship these false gods. Honor God with your lives. Honor God in the way you take care of the temple and the way we practice our normal everyday living. Honor Him. And Joash's response, and we see how quickly his heart has turned, is to execute his mentor's son. To kill him. To make sure he's not around to speak any longer. For God, that's the last straw. Enough is enough. And so He sends in foreign powers to come in a form of judgment and just disrupt the whole kingdom of Judah, to disrupt Joash's reign. In the midst of all that disruption, Joash is injured. And some of those counselors who had steered him away from worshiping the one true God decide now's a good opportunity to get rid of this guy, and his own people execute and assassinate him. And a man whose reign started at the age of 7 with a wise counselor speaking into his ear, and he goes off and does great things and restores the temple and glorifies God and gets the nation back on track. His reign goes. You might remember that Jehoiada was buried with the kings. The priest, not a member of royalty, was buried with the kings, given a place of honor and respect because of the life he had lived, because of what he had done for his country. But Joash, disregarded, disrespected, and he was not buried with the kings. He was not buried with his forefathers. His reign started off great, but it ended terribly. The power of one life to influence another life can be seen both in Jehoiada's presence and his absence. We're gathered this morning inside of a church. We're social people, but we're not a social club. We're a church. We're a group of people who are following God. We're Christ followers. We're following after Jesus. We're trying to become more like Jesus. We want to live and learn and love like Jesus did. And so when we think about the power of one life to influence another, we must channel it and funnel it into the mission that God has called us to. We're all very familiar with Matthew 28 when He said, "Go and make disciples." Something that is instrumental in making disciples is that personal connection, the power of one life to influence and impact another life. It's vital, it's necessary for our mission. If we're going to please the Lord, if we're going to make disciples, we have to have personal connections with people. A few years ago, you may remember this, or maybe it's a little foggy in your mind, the elders of Mayfair Bible Church, the leaders, said, we've gotten kind of lazy at what we do in the disciple-making department. We've come to a place where we rely on the programs to do the work. We get people together in groups and give them the right information, and then we want them to live that way. Now there's a place for that, and there's a time for that, and that's appropriate. But as elders, we also realize we had to admit to ourselves and to the congregation that we've gotten lazy by asking the programs to do it, and we have ignored the power of one, the power of relationships, the power, the impact that one life can have on another We've ignored that when it comes to making disciples, when it comes to being the church that God wants us to be. And so as we begin 2015, and as we go throughout the year, you're going to hear that in a variety of ways from myself and from Jerry and from Dean. And we want to be careful. We want to be intentional about the relational part of what we're doing. We don't want to get to a lazy place where we just expect people to hear stuff and live it. We need to make sure people are connected to one another. That's why we love life groups. We love what's happening as people get to know each other in a way they can't by sitting in a pew. We're excited about that. We see connections happening. There are some cool stories about things that have happened over the last 3 months in life groups that are just wonderful and amazing because people have personal connections with each other. They're not just showing up, sitting in the box, and going outside and going home. They're people that are getting to know each other, and one life is beginning to impact another life. And we're excited about that, and you'll hear about that through the year. But my call this morning is to ask you to join us in that. As one of the things the elders have done is we've held each other accountable in a friendly way. We haven't beaten each other up, gotten out baseball bats or anything. But what we've done is ask each other on a regular basis, who are you connected to? Whose life are you impacting? Who are you meeting with? Are you guys having good discussions? Are you able to point them in the direction of Jesus? We're getting better at that. And as a church, we need to do that. And we're calling and inviting you to do the same thing, to join with us in using the power of your one life to influence another life. Because the power of one life to impact another cannot be underestimated. If you look at the name you wrote down, you know from personal experience how powerful one person can be in your life. If you would, take out that paper again. Part of my invitation and challenge this morning is that